Is that the same cheap dress you wore when I threw you out? The laughter inside the luxury Lagos ballroom exploded as Adewale raised his glass and mocked his ex-wife in front of Africa's richest elites. Yande stood frozen beneath the golden chandeliers, her trembling fingers clutching the small handbag she had sewn herself 3 nights earlier. No one defended her. Not when Adewale called her a poor village woman. Not when his new fiancée smirked at her worn shoes. But what nobody in that room knew was that only hours earlier, Yande had secretly inherited $1 billion empire. And before the night ended, the woman they humiliated would change all of their lives forever. If you're watching right now, tell me your country and local time in the comments. And if you love emotional stories about justice, hope, and powerful life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The morning rain had already flooded half the narrow street by the time Yande opened the rusted metal door of her tiny tailoring shop in Surulere, Lagos. Water crawled along the cracked pavement outside, while Danfo buses splashed muddy puddles onto passing pedestrians. The air smelled of wet dust fried akara from a nearby food stand and exhaust smoke trapped beneath the gray sky. Inside the shop, the ceiling fan turned slowly with a tired squeak, barely pushing away the heat. Yande stood silently near the sewing machine that had become both her survival and her prison. At 34 years old, she looked older than her age. Pain had a way of carving itself into a person's face. Her once bright eyes now carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent years learning how to survive disappointment without complaining about it. She adjusted the sleeve of a school uniform she had been sewing since dawn, carefully guiding the fabric beneath the needle. Every stitch mattered. If she ruined the order, the customer might refuse to pay her. And she desperately needed the money. Her landlord had already threatened to lock her out by the end of the week. Again. You still haven't eaten this morning, Abi. The voice came from Mama Bisi, the old food vendor whose stall stood outside the shop. The elderly woman peeked through the doorway holding a small plate covered with aluminum foil. Yande forced a smile. I'll eat later, Mama. Mama Bisi clicked her tongue in disapproval. That is what you said yesterday. Before Yande could protest, the woman placed the plate on the table beside the sewing machine. Inside were 2 small pieces of yam and pepper sauce. Not much, but enough to remind Yande that kindness still existed somewhere in Lagos. You cannot sew on an empty stomach, Mama Bisi muttered softly before leaving. Yande stared at the food for several seconds. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. There had been a time when she never worried about food, a time when she lived inside a mansion with polished marble floors, security guards at the gate, and walk-in closets larger than this entire shop. A time when she had been Adewale Balogun's wife. The memory arrived the way painful memories always did, suddenly and without mercy. She quickly looked down at the fabric again and continued sewing. Outside, the rain intensified. A loud argument erupted across the street as 2 conductors fought over passengers. A little boy ran barefoot through the floodwater laughing while his mother shouted after him. Life moved on. Lagos always moved on, even when hearts were breaking. Yande reached for her old measuring tape when her phone vibrated on the table beside her. She frowned. Almost nobody called her anymore. Most days her phone remained silent except for debt reminders and customers asking for discounts. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Then she answered quietly. Hello. Good morning. Am I speaking with Miss Yande Akinola? The voice belonged to a man. Calm. Professional, yes. This is Yande. My name is Tayo Afolayan from Afolayan and Partners Legal Chambers. We've been trying to reach you. Yande blinked in confusion. A law office. Yes, ma'am. She sat up straighter. Her first thought was fear. Had she done something wrong? Was there a problem with unpaid taxes for the shop? Or worse? Did Adewale somehow send these people? Her stomach tightened. I think there must be a mistake, she said carefully. There is no mistake, Miss Akinola. We need you to come to our office this afternoon regarding a private family matter. Family. That word alone sent a strange chill through her body. Yande almost laughed bitterly. She had no family left. Her mother had died when she was 19. The few relatives she once depended on disappeared after her divorce from Adewale became public gossip years earlier. People loved standing beside success, but failure frightened them. I'm sorry, she whispered, but I think you have the wrong person. Please, the lawyer continued gently. This matter is important. We would not contact you unless it was necessary. Silence filled the shop. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. Yande's fingers tightened around the phone. How did you get my number? We've been searching for you for weeks. Something about the answer unsettled her deeply. Weeks? Why would strangers search for her? I cannot promise anything, she finally said. Our office is on Victoria Island. I'll send the address shortly. Please come before 5 o'clock. The call ended. Yande lowered the phone slowly. For several moments, she simply stared ahead without moving. The sewing machine sat silent before her. Outside, a motorcycle splashed through dirty water. Life continued normally, but inside her chest, something had shifted. A strange feeling she could not explain. Fear, curiosity, and something else. Something dangerously close to hope. She hated hope. Hope had betrayed her before. Years ago, she had believed love could survive poverty. She had believed marriage meant loyalty. She had believed a husband would protect his wife instead of humiliating her. But life had taught her differently, especially after Adewale changed. In the beginning, he had not been rich. That was the cruelest part. Yande had loved him before the expensive suits, before the luxury cars, before business magazines started printing his photograph, beside headlines calling him the young lion of Lagos real estate. She remembered nights when they shared one loaf of bread for dinner and laughed anyway. Back then, Adewale used to hold her hands and promise her that when success finally came, they would enjoy it together. But money changed him slowly, then completely. First came embarrassment. He stopped bringing colleagues home because he thought Yande spoke too simply. Then came criticism. Her clothes were too local. Her English sounded too soft. Her tailoring business looked small-minded. And finally came shame. The kind of shame that makes a man look at the woman who suffered beside him and suddenly pretend he built his life alone. Yande closed her eyes briefly. She did not want to remember the rest. Not today. Her phone vibrated again. A text message. The office address, Victoria Island, one of the richest parts of Lagos. She almost laughed. People like her did not belong there anymore. Still, her eyes drifted toward the tiny, cracked mirror hanging beside the shop wall. Her reflection looked tired, but not defeated. Not completely. Maybe that was why she suddenly stood up and walked toward the back corner where old fabric materials were stacked inside a plastic container. She searched quietly through them. Blue fabric, too faded. Green fabric, too thin. Then finally, a soft cream-colored material. Simple. Cheap, but elegant enough if sewn properly. Yande touched the fabric gently. An idea slowly formed in her mind. If she was going to walk into a law office in Victoria Island, she refused to look broken, even if she truly was. For the first time in many months, determination flickered quietly inside her eyes. And somewhere far across Lagos, hidden behind glass towers and billion-dollar secrets, forces had already begun moving toward her life. Though Yande did not know it yet, everything was about to change. Long before the luxury cars, the expensive watches, and the magazine interviews, Adewale Balogun used to sleep on a thin mattress beside Yande inside a cramped one-room apartment with leaking windows. And back then, he used to look at her as if she were the greatest blessing God had ever given him. The memory lived inside Yande like an old scar that still ached whenever rain touched it. That afternoon, as she sat alone inside her tiny tailoring shop, waiting for the storm outside to calm her mind, drifted unwillingly into the past. Back to the beginning, back to the version of Adewale she once loved. They had met 12 years earlier at a crowded bus stop near Yaba Market. Yande had been balancing a tray of fabrics on her head while rushing to deliver sewing materials for her employer. One careless Danfo driver splashed muddy water across her dress, nearly knocking her into the road. Before she could fall, someone caught her arm. A young man in a faded white shirt, tall, thin, smiling. "You almost entered heaven before your time," he joked. Yande remembered how annoyed she felt at first, and how 5 minutes later she found herself laughing beside him anyway. At that time, Adewale sold phone accessories from a tiny roadside kiosk. Some days he earned enough to eat, some days he did not, but he carried himself with ambition, not arrogance. Ambition. There was a difference. He used to talk endlessly about his dreams. One day he would own buildings across Lagos. One day he would become powerful enough that nobody could insult him for being poor again. One day he would give Yande a beautiful life. And Yande believed him. Not because he was rich, but because he was kind. In those early years, they survived together, like two stubborn fighters, refusing to surrender to hardship. When Yande became sick with typhoid, Adewale slept on the hospital floor beside her bed. When Adewale's kiosk was robbed one night, Yande sold her only gold earrings to help him start again. They built each other from almost nothing. That was why the betrayal later destroyed her so completely, because she had not married a stranger. She had married the man who once cried while promising never to hurt her. Yande stared quietly at the rain sliding down her shop window. Outside traffic crawled slowly through flooded streets. Inside her chest, old pain moved like a restless ghost. The first signs of change came after Adewale secured a major contract with a real estate company on Victoria Island. Everything happened quickly after that. New office, new car, new friends, new habits. At first, Yande tried to be happy for him. She ignored the fact that he no longer ate dinner at home most nights, ignored the perfume scent that sometimes lingered on his shirts, ignored the growing coldness in his voice whenever she spoke about ordinary things. But success transformed Adewale in ways neither of them expected. Or maybe it simply revealed the parts of him that poverty once hid. Soon he became embarrassed by anything that reminded him of where he came from, especially Yande. "You need to improve yourself," he started saying often. At first, the comments sounded harmless. "You should learn how rich people speak. You should stop tying your hair like market women. You cannot dress like this around my clients." Then the comments became sharper, crueler. One evening, Yande spent hours cooking Adewale's favorite meal after hearing he secured another business deal. But when he arrived home with two wealthy investors, he barely looked at her. "This is my wife," he said casually. Not proudly, not warmly, just casually. The men shook her hand politely, but Yande noticed the embarrassment on Adewale's face when she spoke broken English during dinner. That night, after the guests left, he exploded. "Do you know how important those men are?" he snapped. Yande blinked in confusion. "What did I do wrong?" "You embarrassed me." The words hit her harder than she expected. "I was only trying to welcome them." "You sounded uneducated." Silence filled the dining room. Yande remembered staring at him as if she no longer recognized the man before her. "Adewale," she whispered carefully, "you used to say you loved the way I spoke. That was before." Before. One simple word, but it shattered something inside her. After that night, their marriage began collapsing piece by piece. Adewale started attending events without her. He hired consultants to change his accent. He mocked the small tailoring business Yande loved. Then came the rumors. Women, models, socialites, daughters of politicians. Yande heard the gossip long before she saw proof herself. Still, she fought for the marriage, not because she lacked pride, but because she remembered who Adewale used to be. She kept believing the old version of him would return, until the night everything ended. Even now, years later, that memory still haunted her sleep. It had been raining that evening, too. Yande remembered standing inside their massive living room while thunder shook the windows. Adewale stood across from her, holding divorce papers. Cold, impatient, like a man trying to finish an unpleasant meeting quickly. "I cannot continue living like this," he said flatly. Yande felt numb. "What are you talking about? You no longer fit into my life?" The words stole the air from her lungs. "Adewale, you belong to the past." She shook her head slowly, unable to process what she was hearing. "I stood beside you when nobody respected you. And I appreciate that," he replied coldly. "But people grow. Grow." Again, that word. As if love were something temporary. As if loyalty expired once money arrived. Yande remembered begging him to talk calmly, begging him to remember everything they survived together. But Adewale's heart had already left the marriage long before that night. Then came the sentence she would never forget for the rest of her life. "You look like poverty itself," he said quietly. The silence afterward felt louder than thunder. Yande felt her soul crack open, not because of the insult alone, but because the man speaking was once the same man who kissed her hands while promising she was enough. That night, Adewale ordered security guards to remove her belongings from the house. No dignity, no compassion, just humiliation. Yande walked into the rain carrying one old suitcase while luxury cars passed slowly outside the mansion gates. Nobody stopped her. Nobody defended her. And Adewale never came after her. Back inside the tailoring shop, Yande slowly wiped a tear from her cheek before it could fall completely. She hated crying, especially over someone who no longer deserved her pain. But memories were stubborn things. Sometimes they returned without permission. Her phone vibrated again, suddenly pulling her back to the present. Another reminder from the lawyer's office. Her appointment was in less than 2 hours. Yande inhaled slowly. Then she stood up. Across the room, the cream-colored fabric still rested on the table, waiting to become a dress. A simple dress. Nothing luxurious. Nothing expensive. But as Yande touched the material again, she felt something unfamiliar rising quietly inside her. Not hope. Not yet. Something else. The first small spark of a woman who had suffered enough. And somewhere far away, Adewale Balogun was preparing for another glamorous evening, completely unaware that the woman he discarded years ago was about to walk back into his world. This time, everything would be different. The electricity went out again just after midnight. The small tailoring shop fell into darkness except for the weak orange glow from a kerosene lamp sitting beside Yande's sewing machine. Outside, the sound of distant generators filled the humid Lagos night, while rainwater dripped steadily from broken gutters along the street. Yande did not stop sewing. Her tired eyes remained fixed on the cream-colored fabric beneath her fingers as the old machine rattled softly in the darkness. Every stitch had to be perfect, not because the dress was expensive. It was not. The material itself had come from leftover fabric scraps she once saved for customers who could not afford full designs. The cloth was simple, almost plain, but Yande's hands moved with the quiet skill of someone who understood beauty did not always require wealth. Sometimes dignity alone could make something beautiful. She paused briefly to rub her aching neck. The clock, hanging on the wall, showed 12:47 a.m. Most people in the neighborhood were already asleep, but anxiety would not allow Yande to rest. All evening, the lawyer's phone call had echoed inside her mind. "We've been searching for you for weeks." The sentence unsettled her deeply. What kind of family matter required lawyers to search for a poor tailor hidden in one forgotten corner of Lagos? Part of her wanted to ignore the meeting completely. Life had taught her to distrust sudden miracles. Too often, hope arrived disguised as disaster. Still, another part of her could not silence the curiosity growing inside her chest. She carefully adjusted the fabric again. The dress was modest, long sleeves, soft neckline, elegant without trying too hard. The type of dress respectable women wore to church or formal offices. Yande smiled faintly to herself. Years ago, Adewale used to brag about her designs to his friends. "My wife can turn ordinary fabric into royalty," he once said proudly. The memory stung. She quickly pushed it away. No, tonight was not about Adewale. Tonight was about survival. The landlord would come again tomorrow morning demanding rent. Mama Bisi's food stall nearly closed last month because of rising prices, and Yande herself had only 2,000 naira left after buying transportation for Victoria Island. She could not afford emotional weakness. Not anymore. Suddenly, loud laughter erupted outside the shop. Yande glanced toward the window. Two young women stood beneath a nearby umbrella, waiting for rain to stop. They were dressed in bright club clothes, holding high heels in one hand while scrolling through phones with the other. One of them noticed Yande through the open doorway. "Ah, she said loudly enough to be heard. "See this woman still working by candlelight like village people?" The second woman laughed. "She probably cannot even afford fuel for generator." Yande lowered her eyes quietly and continued sewing. She was used to humiliation. Poor people in Lagos learned early that society treated poverty like a personal failure instead of a wound. The girls eventually walked away, still laughing. Yande pretended not to care. But the comments remained, not because they were new, because they were true. At least partly. The shop really was falling apart. Her shoes truly were worn out. And tomorrow, she would walk into one of the wealthiest districts in Nigeria, dressed in clothes she made herself because she could not afford anything else. The thought made her stomach tighten. For a brief moment, fear almost won. What if the lawyers looked at her with pity? What if she arrived only to discover some terrible misunderstanding? What if security guards refused to let her inside because she looked too poor? Yande stopped sewing. Silence filled the room except for rainfall outside. Then slowly she looked at her reflection in the dark window glass. Thin face, tired eyes, simple headscarf. A woman carrying too many disappointments. But beneath all that pain, something stronger still existed. She had survived betrayal, humiliation, loneliness, hunger. And somehow she was still standing. That had to mean something. Yande inhaled deeply and turned back to the machine. "No more fear," she whispered softly to herself. The sewing resumed. Hours later, dawn finally arrived. Golden sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds outside, while Lagos awakened with its usual chaos. Horns blaring, buses shouting for passengers, traders arranging goods beside the roadside. Yande finished the final stitch, just as the first call to prayer echoed faintly through the neighborhood. She leaned back slowly. The dress was complete, simple, clean, graceful, not luxurious, but beautiful. For several seconds, she simply stared at it silently. Then emotion unexpectedly rose inside her throat. Not because of the dress itself, but because it reminded her of the woman she used to be before life crushed her confidence. A woman who created things with pride. A woman who believed she mattered. A knock suddenly sounded at the door. Mama Bisi entered, carrying a small plastic container. "I knew you did not sleep," the old woman muttered. Yande smiled weakly. "How your light was still on when I woke up for morning prayers." Mama Bisi noticed the dress hanging nearby, and her eyes widened slightly. "You made this overnight?" Yande nodded. The old woman walked closer, touching the fabric gently. "Beautiful." "It's just something simple." "No," Mama Bisi corrected firmly. "It is elegant." Yande looked away awkwardly. Compliments felt unfamiliar now. Mama Bisi studied her carefully. "You are nervous." Yande hesitated before answering. "I don't know why those lawyers want to see me. Maybe God finally remembered your address." The old woman laughed softly at her own joke. But Yande could not laugh. Hope still frightened her too much. By late afternoon, she finally boarded a crowded bus heading toward Victoria Island. The journey itself felt like moving between two different worlds. As the bus left the crowded mainland streets behind Lagos gradually transformed. The roads became smoother, the buildings taller. Glass towers reflected sunlight like mirrors. Luxury cars moved silently past street vendors, balancing fruit trays on their heads. Yande sat quietly near the window, clutching her handbag tightly. Inside the bag were only three things: her phone, a small purse, and the old photograph from her wedding day she still could not bring herself to throw away. The bus finally stopped near a massive office building covered entirely in blue-tinted glass. Afolayan and Partners. Yande's heartbeat quickened immediately. People in expensive suits moved confidently through the entrance while security guards opened doors for arriving clients. Everyone looked polished, powerful, important. Yande suddenly became painfully aware of her cheap shoes. For several seconds, she remained frozen outside the building. Fear returned instantly. What if she embarrassed herself? What if everyone inside looked at her the same way Adewale once did near the end of their marriage, like someone who no longer belonged beside success? A black SUV pulled into the parking lot beside her. A wealthy woman stepped out wearing designer sunglasses and heels probably worth more than 6 months of Yande's rent. The woman glanced briefly at Yande's dress, then at her shoes, and immediately looked away, dismissed, invisible. Yande felt the humiliation crawl beneath her skin again. For one dangerous moment, she almost turned around, almost walked away, almost returned to her tiny shop where disappointment felt safer than hope. Then her phone vibrated, a message from the lawyer. "We are expecting you, Miss Akinola." Yande stared at the words silently. Then slowly, she lifted her chin. Whatever waited inside that building, she would face it, even if the entire world looked down on her. With trembling hands but steady steps, Yande walked toward the towering glass doors of Afolayan and Partners, completely unaware that the moment she crossed that entrance, her old life would begin disappearing forever. The cold air inside Afolayan and Partners felt unnatural to Yande. The marble floors gleamed beneath soft golden lights, while quiet instrumental music floated through the massive reception area. Men in expensive suits walked past, carrying leather briefcases, speaking calmly into wireless headsets. Everything inside the building smelled of polished wood coffee and money. Yande stood awkwardly near the entrance, clutching her handbag tightly against her chest. For a moment, nobody approached her. A receptionist, sitting behind a curved white desk, glanced at Yande briefly before returning to her computer screen. The look lasted only 2 seconds, but Yande recognized it immediately. Judgment, the kind rich people often gave poor people without saying a word. Yande lowered her eyes toward her shoes. Maybe she truly did not belong here. A younger receptionist finally walked over with a polite but cautious smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you?" Yande swallowed nervously. I have an appointment with Mr. Tayo Afolayan." The woman's expression changed immediately. "You are Miss Yande Akinola." 1 second later, the receptionist straightened respectfully. "Oh, we've been expecting you." "Expecting you." Again, those strange words. The receptionist quickly picked up the office phone. "She's here," she said quietly. A few moments later, a tall man wearing a navy blue suit emerged from a nearby hallway. He appeared to be in his late 50s with silver gray hair, calm eyes, and the controlled posture of someone accustomed to authority. "Miss Akinola," he said warmly, "I'm Olumide Afolayan." Yande stood slowly. The lawyer extended his hand politely. Unlike the others, he did not glance at her clothes first. He looked directly into her eyes. And somehow, that simple gesture unsettled her more than disrespect would have. "Thank you for coming," he said. Yande nodded quietly. "I almost didn't." A faint smile crossed his face. That would have complicated several very important matters. He gestured toward the hallway. "Please come with me." Yande followed him silently through the enormous office building. The deeper they walked, the quieter everything became. Framed photographs lined the walls, politicians, presidents, business moguls, international ceremonies. In nearly every picture, Olumide Afolayan stood beside powerful people. Yande suddenly realized this was no ordinary lawyer. This was a man trusted by Africa's elite, which only made her confusion worse. Why would someone like him search for a struggling tailor? They eventually entered a private conference room overlooking Victoria Island through massive glass windows. The city stretched endlessly below. Luxury towers, ocean views, endless traffic. A Lagos Yande once briefly belonged to, before life threw her out of it. "Please, Sir," Olumide said gently. Yande obeyed cautiously. A young assistant entered carrying tea and bottled water before quietly leaving again. Silence settled across the room. Then the lawyer opened a thick file resting on the table. His face became serious. "What I'm about to tell you may be difficult to process," he began calmly. Yande's stomach tightened. Immediately, fear returned. "Am I in trouble?" "No." "Then why have you been searching for me?" Olumide studied her carefully before answering. "Because someone spent many years trying to keep you hidden." Yande frowned. "I don't understand." The lawyer slowly removed an old photograph from the file and slid it gently across the table toward her. Yande looked down, then froze completely. The photograph showed a younger version of her mother standing beside a tall, distinguished man wearing traditional Ghanaian attire. The man's face was powerful, familiar somehow. Yande's breathing slowed. "That's my mother," she whispered. "Yes." Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the photo. "I've never seen this picture before." The lawyer leaned back quietly. The man beside her was Chief Jabari Mensah. The name hit the room with enormous weight. Even Yande, who spent most of her life far from wealthy circles, recognized it instantly. Chief Jabari Mensah, founder of Mensah Global Holdings, one of the richest businessmen in West Africa. Banks, oil investments, shipping companies, real estate, telecommunications, the kind of wealth ordinary people only heard about on television. Yande stared at the lawyer in disbelief. "No," she whispered immediately. "That's impossible." Olumide remained calm. "Your mother, Adesua Akinola, met Chief Mensah 35 years ago while working at a hotel in Accra." Yande shook her head slowly. "No." "They had a relationship." "No." The word escaped more sharply this time. Not angry, afraid. because deep inside something already sensed the truth before her mind accepted it. Olumide opened another file. Inside were documents, birth certificates, letters, photographs, proof, carefully preserved proof. Yande felt dizzy. My mother never told me any of this. She was paid to remain silent. Yande looked up instantly. What? The lawyer's expression darkened slightly. Chief Mensah's family considered your mother unsuitable. Powerful families often fear scandal more than cruelty. Yande's chest tightened painfully. So my mother was abandoned. Olumide hesitated before answering. Chief Mensah later attempted to find both of you again, but by then your mother had already disappeared from Ghana. Yande's thoughts spun violently. Nothing made sense anymore. All her life she believed her father was simply unknown. Another absent man who walked away before she was born. Now suddenly, one of the richest men in Africa. It sounded absurd, impossible, cruel even. Why are you telling me this now? She asked quietly. The room became silent again. Olumide closed the file slowly. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. Because Chief Jabari Mensah died 3 weeks ago. Yande stopped breathing for a moment. Dead. The strange heaviness in the lawyer's voice suddenly made sense. He left behind very specific instructions. Before his death, Olumide continued carefully. Instructions that included finding you. Yande stared blankly ahead. This could not be real. Nothing in her life had ever prepared her for a conversation like this. Not the poverty, not the divorce, not the years of humiliation. She looked down again at the old photograph in her hands. Her mother looked happy beside the powerful man. Truly happy. The sight broke something open inside Yande unexpectedly, because for the first time in years, she realized her mother carried secrets too. Pain too. Perhaps even heartbreak. Yande's eyes slowly filled with tears. He knew about me. Yes. Then why didn't he come? Olumide's voice softened. That is a complicated story, Miss Akinola. Complicated. The rich always used beautiful words for ugly things. Abandonment became complicated. Cruelty became business. Betrayal became strategy. Yande quickly wiped her eyes. She refused to cry inside this office. Then Olumide opened one final folder, the thickest one yet. Chief Mensah never had any other surviving children, he said carefully. Yande frowned slightly. What does that have to do with me? The lawyer looked directly at her. Everything. He slowly slid another document toward her. A will. Official. Stamped. Signed. Legal. Yande stared at it without understanding. Then Olumide spoke quietly. You are the sole heir to the Mensah estate. Silence. Complete silence. Outside the giant windows, Lagos continued moving endlessly. Cars, boats, people, noise. But inside the room, Yande's world stopped completely. No, she whispered faintly. Olumide nodded slowly. Chief Jabari Mensah left his controlling shares, properties, investments, and leadership rights to you. Yande's pulse thundered violently now. How much? The lawyer hesitated, then answered carefully. Approximately $1.3 billion. The number sounded unreal, like something from another universe. Yande almost laughed from shock. Yesterday she worried about rent. Yesterday she counted coins before buying bread. Yesterday strangers mocked her worn-out shoes. And now this man sat calmly across from her, claiming she owned $1 billion empire. No, she whispered again. There has to be a mistake. There is no mistake. I'm just a tailor. Olumide's eyes softened slightly. No, Miss Akinola. He paused carefully. You were hidden from your true life. Yande sat frozen, while tears slowly gathered in her eyes again. Not from happiness, from overwhelming confusion. Because suddenly, every part of her old life felt unstable, and somewhere deep inside her heart, another, terrifying realization quietly began forming. If this was true, then one day she would stand face to face again with the people who once humiliated her for being nothing. Especially Adewale Balogun. And next time, everything would be different. Yande barely remembered how she left the conference room. The world outside the glass walls of Afolayan and Partners no longer looked real. Victoria Island blurred around her as if Lagos itself had become a dream she could not fully touch. Billionaire, heiress, Mensa Global Holdings. The words repeated endlessly inside her mind while she sat silently in the back seat of the black car Olumide had arranged to take her home. Rainwater streaked across the tinted windows while evening traffic crawled through the city. Motorcycles squeezed between luxury SUVs. Street hawkers balanced plantains and bottled drinks beside expensive cars worth more than entire neighborhoods. Two different worlds living side by side. Yande suddenly realized she no longer knew which world she belonged to. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Madame, are you all right?" Yande nodded automatically, even though she was not. Not even close. Her fingers tightened around the handbag resting on her lap. Inside it, folded carefully between old receipts and sewing measurements, sat copies of the documents Olumide had given her. Proof. Legal proof. Her name now existed beside unimaginable wealth. But somehow, instead of joy, fear kept growing inside her chest. Because deep down, Yande understood something dangerous about money. Money did not change people. It revealed them. And she had already seen what wealth revealed inside Adewale. Cruelty, shame, pride. What if power transformed her too? The thought unsettled her more than the inheritance itself. By the time the car reached Surulere, darkness had already covered the streets. Small roadside shops glowed beneath weak bulbs, powered by noisy generators, while loud Afrobeats music drifted from nearby bars. The driver stopped in front of Yande's tailoring shop. For several seconds, he simply stared outside in confusion. This place, even he clearly struggled to believe someone connected to $1 billion empire lived there. "Thank you," Yande said softly, before stepping out. The driver hesitated. "Madame, Mr. Afolayan instructed me to remain available if you need transportation." Yande almost smiled sadly. Nobody had called her Madame with respect in years. "I'll be fine." The driver nodded uncertainly before leaving. Yande stood alone outside her shop and watching the expensive car disappear into the night. Then slowly she entered the tiny room that had been her entire world for the past 4 years. Nothing had changed inside. The same cracked walls, the same worn curtains, the same weak ceiling fan. Her sewing machine still rested near the window, exactly where she left it earlier that morning. And yet, Everything felt different now. Yande sat down quietly. For a long time, she simply listened to the hum of generators outside. Then finally, she opened the envelope again. Documents spilled across the table. Property records in Accra. Bank accounts. Corporate shares. Private estates. Numbers so large they almost looked absurd. Yande stared at them blankly. Then, suddenly, she laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the shock became too heavy to carry silently. The laughter quickly turned into tears. Within seconds, Yande buried her face in her hands and cried harder than she had cried in years. Not graceful tears, not quiet tears, the kind of crying that comes when life changes too suddenly for the heart to catch up. All her suffering, all her humiliation, all those nights she slept hungry while wondering whether God had forgotten her. And somewhere, during those same years, a billionaire father had existed without her. The unfairness of it broke something open inside her. A soft knock interrupted her tears. Yande Mamabisi's voice. Yande quickly wiped her face before opening the door. The elderly woman entered carrying a small bowl of stew. But the moment she saw Yande's swollen eyes, her expression changed immediately. What happened? Yande hesitated. How could she even explain something this unbelievable? Mamabisi sat beside her slowly. Did the lawyers trouble you? No. Then why are you crying like this? Yande looked down at the documents scattered across the table. For several seconds, she could not speak. Finally, she whispered, "They said my father was one of the richest men in Africa." Silence. Mamabisi blinked. What? Yande gave a weak, broken laugh. I know how it sounds. The old woman slowly picked up one document and adjusted her glasses. Her eyes widened immediately. Mensa Global Holdings. Yande nodded faintly. They said he died. Mamabisi lowered herself into the chair carefully, as if her legs suddenly weakened. My God, they said he left everything to me. The old woman stared at Yande for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, tears filled her own eyes too. You suffered all these years while carrying this destiny. Yande shook her head slowly. No, don't say that. But it's true. I am still the same person. Mamabisi reached for her hand gently. Yes, and that is exactly why God trusted you with it. The words settled deeply inside Yande. God trusted you with it. But did he? Yande wasn't sure. Because fear still outweighed hope. Late that night, after Mamabisi finally left, Yande remained awake alone beneath the weak light bulb hanging above her bed. Sleep refused to come. Her thoughts drifted constantly between past and future. A father she never knew. An empire she never wanted. And Adewale, always Adewale. Somewhere across Lagos, her ex-husband probably sat inside another expensive restaurant, laughing with rich friends who still mocked ordinary people. Would he believe this story if he heard it? Would he regret throwing her away? The questions disturbed her. Not because she still loved him, but because part of her still carried scars he created. Around 2 a.m. her phone rang suddenly. Yande startled immediately. Olumide Afolayan. She hesitated before answering. Hello. Forgive the late call, the lawyer said calmly, but there are urgent matters we need to discuss. Yande sat upright. What kind of matters? News of Chief Mensah's death has already created tension inside the company. Yande's stomach tightened. Meaning, there are board members who expected control of the empire after his passing. And now they know about me. Not yet. Yande exhaled slightly. That's good, for now, Olumide corrected carefully. But secrecy will not last forever. Yande pressed her fingers against her forehead. Everything suddenly felt too large, too dangerous. I don't know anything about running companies, she admitted quietly. You can learn. I'm just a tailor. No, Olumide said again firmly. You are Chief Mensah's daughter. The statement still felt foreign every time she heard it. Yande looked around her tiny room, peeling paint, plastic buckets, catching rainwater leaks. Fabric scraps stacked beside unpaid bills. Nothing here looked connected to billionaires. Please, she whispered softly, don't announce anything yet. Silence lingered briefly on the line. Why? Because people change when money appears. Olumide understood immediately. Yande continued quietly. I need time to think. You may not have much time. Please. The desperation in her voice softened the lawyer's tone. Finally, he sighed. Very well. I can delay the public announcement temporarily, but eventually you must decide whether you are willing to step into this position. After the call ended, Yande sat motionless for a long time. Then slowly, she stood and walked toward the cracked mirror hanging near the wall. She stared at her reflection carefully. Simple cream dress, tired eyes, a woman the world overlooked daily. Could this woman truly lead a billion-dollar empire? The answer felt impossible, and yet somewhere deep beneath her fear, another feeling quietly began rising. Not greed, not revenge, responsibility. Because if all this wealth truly belonged to her now, then maybe her suffering had not been meaningless after all. Maybe she understood pain in ways wealthy people never could. Maybe that mattered. Outside Lagos continued roaring through the night. And somewhere in another part of the city, powerful men were already preparing to fight over the empire. Yande did not yet realize she possessed the strength to protect. Adewale Balogun hated silence, especially the kind of silence that came after investors stopped believing in him. He stood near the massive glass windows of his office tower in Ikoyi, staring down at Lagos traffic, while tension tightened across his jaw. Below him, the city still moved with its usual energy, yellow buses weaving recklessly between luxury cars, street traders, chasing vehicles at red lights, pedestrians hurrying beneath the burning afternoon sun. But inside Adewale's office, the atmosphere felt cold, heavy, dangerous. You promised this deal would be secured 2 months ago. The voice belonged to Richard Dlamini, one of the South African investors currently seated across the conference table. His tone remained calm, but irritation hid beneath every word. Adewale turned slowly. We're finalizing negotiations. No, Richard replied sharply. You're stalling. Silence settled over the room. 3 investors sat watching Adewale carefully now, judging him, measuring weakness. Adewale hated that look more than anything, because once upon a time he had been the man everyone admired. Young, aggressive, brilliant. the self-made Lagos businessman who climbed from poverty into wealth before turning 40. Business magazines called him visionary. Television hosts invited him to motivational interviews. Politicians shook his hand publicly. Women admired him. Men envied him. And Adewale enjoyed every second of it. But success had become harder to maintain than it was to achieve. The real estate market was collapsing faster than the public realized. Several of Adewale's luxury projects had stalled due to hidden debt problems, and international investors were beginning to notice the cracks beneath his polished image. Only a few people knew the truth, and Adewale intended to keep it that way. For now. "We need liquidity immediately," another investor said firmly. "Without the Mensa Global contract, this company is exposed." The mention of Mensa Global instantly sharpened the tension inside the room. Adewale maintained a controlled expression even though anxiety flickered inside him. Mensa Global Holdings, the biggest opportunity of his career. The company was preparing a massive expansion into luxury residential developments across Nigeria and Ghana. Whoever secured the partnership would dominate West African real estate for years. And Adewale desperately needed that contract, not only for profit, for survival. "I already told you," he said calmly, "I have connections inside Mensa Global." Richard folded his arms. "Your connections were with Chief Jabari Mensa." A brief silence followed. Everyone knew about the billionaire's recent death. The business world across Africa had practically frozen when the news broke. Chief Mensa was not merely wealthy, he was power itself. And now his empire sat vulnerable while investors, politicians, and rivals circled like hungry animals waiting for weakness. Adewale walked toward the table slowly. "Which is exactly why this is the perfect moment," he said confidently. "Transitions create opportunity." The investors exchanged uncertain glances. Richard finally sighed. "There's a gala next week." Adewale nodded immediately. "Yes, Mensa Global is hosting Africa's major business leaders there. I'm aware." Richard leaned forward. "If you fail to secure this contract, Adewale, we pull out." The words landed like stones. Not because Adewale looked surprised, because deep down he already knew it was coming. The investors no longer trusted him completely. His charm still worked in public, but numbers did not lie forever. After the meeting finally ended, the office slowly emptied. Adewale loosened his tie and poured himself a drink from the expensive whiskey bottle resting beside the shelf. His reflection stared back at him through the dark glass windows. Perfect suit, luxury watch, sharp haircut, confidence, everything carefully maintained. Yet beneath the image, exhaustion quietly spread through him. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Then the office door opened. Zinel entered gracefully, tall, elegant, beautiful in the polished way wealthy women often were. Designer heels clicked softly across the marble floor, while expensive perfume filled the room. "You survived the meeting?" she asked lightly. Adewale forced a smile. "Barely." Zinhli approached him slowly and adjusted his tie. "You worry too much." "That's easy for someone born into money to say," she smirked faintly. "You're still charming when stressed." Adewale kissed her forehead distractedly before moving away. Their relationship looked perfect from the outside. Power couple, luxury vacations, magazine features, public affection. Exactly the kind of woman Adewale once dreamed of standing beside. Sophisticated, connected, respected by elite society. Nothing like Yande. The thought arrived suddenly, unexpectedly, and irritated him immediately. He took another sip of whiskey. Zinli noticed the shift in his expression. What? Nothing. You made that face again. What face? The face you make whenever you're thinking about your ex-wife. Adewale laughed dryly. Trust me, I don't spend my days thinking about Yande. But even as he said the words, memories briefly surfaced anyway. Yande, sitting beside him during his broke years, helping him organize business receipts late into the night. Yande, praying quietly for him before investor meetings. Yande smiling proudly the day he bought his first car. A strange discomfort moved inside his chest. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated. Because part of Adewale knew he had destroyed someone good, but another part still believed success justified everything. You know, Zinhili said casually, while checking her phone, people still talk about how dramatic your divorce was. Adewale's jaw tightened slightly. People in Lagos gossip about everything. They say she disappeared completely after you left her. She moved on, did she? Zinhili glanced up, or did she simply have no choice? The question irritated him more than it should have. Adewale walked toward the window again. Why are we discussing this? Because next week matters. He turned back toward her. The gala? Yes. Zinhili crossed her arms carefully. You cannot afford distractions right now. Adewale understood exactly what she meant. Perception mattered in elite circles. Weakness destroyed reputations quickly. And wealthy people hated scandal almost as much as failure. I'll handle it, he said firmly. Zinhil studied him quietly. Then her expression softened slightly. My father still believes in you. Adewale nodded slowly. That mattered. Zinhil's family connections were one of the few reasons investors remained patient with him. Without them, his company might already be collapsing publicly. Later that evening, after Zinhili finally left, Adewale remained alone inside the office long after sunset. Lagos glittered outside beneath endless city lights. His phone buzzed suddenly. A message from his assistant. Reminder, Mensa Global Gala. Attendance confirmed. Adewale stared at the screen thoughtfully. This gala was everything now. If he impressed the right people, he could still save the company. If he failed, he quickly pushed the thought away. Failure was not an option. Not for someone like him. Adewale Balogun had spent years building an image too powerful to collapse publicly. He would fight before allowing poverty near him again. Because poverty terrified him. More than shame, more than loneliness, more than losing love. And perhaps that fear was exactly what transformed him into the kind of man who once threw his own wife into the rain. Meanwhile, far across Lagos, Yande sat quietly inside her small tailoring shop, staring at documents that could change both their lives forever. Neither of them fully understood it yet. But destiny was already pulling them toward each other once again, toward the same ballroom, the same humiliation, the same reckoning. And when Adewale finally saw Yande again, he would never forget it. The invitation arrived 3 days before the gala, a black envelope, heavy, elegant, dangerous. Yande stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. The gold lettering across the front almost made her hands tremble. Mensa Global Holdings, Private Leadership, Gala Echo Atlantic Lagos. Below it, another line had been handwritten personally by Olumide Afolayan. You must attend. No excuses. Yande slowly lowered the invitation onto the table beside her sewing machine. Outside her shop, Lagos roared with its usual chaos. Conductors shouting destinations, generators vibrating through narrow streets, traders arguing over prices beneath the burning afternoon sun. But inside her tiny room, silence settled heavily around her. Attend. How could she possibly attend a gathering filled with billionaires, politicians, and corporate elites? She still patched holes in her only handbag with thread scraps. Her landlord still threatened eviction every morning. And despite the documents now hidden carefully beneath her mattress, nothing about her life outwardly looked wealthy. Nothing except fear. That had changed. Fear followed her everywhere now. Not fear of poverty. She already knew poverty intimately. This was different. Fear of entering a world powerful enough to destroy people quietly. Fear of becoming someone she no longer recognized. Fear of seeing Adewale again. That last fear disturbed her most. Because despite everything he did to her, part of her still hated the idea of standing before him as if she wanted revenge. She did not want revenge. At least that was what she kept telling herself. Mama Bisi entered the shop, carrying a basket of oranges balanced against her hip. You've been staring at that envelope like it insulted your ancestors? The old woman muttered. Yande gave a tired smile. They want me at the gala. Mama Bisi froze. The big gala. Yande nodded slowly. The one all those rich people are attending? Yes. Mama Bisi placed the basket down carefully before sitting beside her. You should go. Yande laughed softly in disbelief. With what clothes? The old woman glanced around the tiny shop. Then her eyes settled on the cream-colored fabric folded near the sewing machine. Immediately understanding crossed her face. You've already decided what to wear. Yande looked down quietly. The dress was finished now. Simple, elegant, but painfully modest compared to the luxury gowns wealthy women would wear at the gala. Sometimes she stared at it, wondering whether it was foolish to even try. You don't understand, Yande whispered softly. People like me don't belong in rooms like that. Mama Bisi's expression sharpened. People like you, Yande sighed heavily. I know how those people think. The old woman folded her arms. And how do they think they see poverty before humanity? Silence lingered, because both women knew it was true. Yande had experienced it too many times already. The dismissive glances, the polite disrespect, the way wealthy people often spoke kindly while silently deciding your worth by your clothes. Mama Bisi reached over and squeezed Yande's hand gently. Listen to me carefully, she said softly. God did not bring you this far so you could hide. Yande looked away. I'm not hiding. Yes, you are. The words landed harder than expected. Mama Bisi continued quietly. You survived humiliation already. Why fear rich people now? Because rich people destroyed her marriage. Because wealth turned Adewale into a stranger. Because powerful people always seem to demand pieces of your soul before accepting you. But Yande could not explain all that aloud. Instead, she simply whispered, What if they laugh at me? Mama Bisi smiled sadly. Then let them laugh. The answer lingered long after the old woman left. That evening, Yande stood before the cracked mirror in her room while holding the cream-colored dress against herself. The fabric flowed softly beneath the dim light, beautiful in its own quiet way. Not flashy, not expensive, just honest, like the woman wearing it. And maybe that was enough. The night of the gala arrived warm and bright. Lagos glittered beneath endless city lights, while luxury cars flooded toward Echo Atlantic like rivers of black glass and chrome. The event itself occupied one of the most exclusive waterfront venues in Nigeria, a towering building surrounded by palm trees, fountains, and armed security guards. Inside, chandeliers sparkled above marble floors, while live orchestras played soft instrumental music near enormous flower arrangements imported from Europe. Africa's elite had gathered there. Oil tycoons, politicians, celebrities, corporate giants. Everywhere Yande looked, wealth shimmered effortlessly. Diamonds flashed beneath soft lights. Designer gowns swept across polished floors. Men spoke casually about deals worth millions of dollars, while waiters carried trays of champagne between them. Yande stood near the entrance, gripping her handbag tightly enough to hurt her fingers. The cream dress she had sewn herself suddenly felt painfully small inside a room filled with luxury. Several women glanced toward her immediately. Not openly rude. Worse. Curious. Dismissive. One woman whispered something quietly to her companion before both laughed behind polite smiles. Yande felt heat crawl beneath her skin. She almost turned around. Almost walked out before anyone important noticed her. Then Olumide Afolayan appeared beside her. "You came," he said warmly. Yande forced a weak smile. "I'm beginning to regret it." The lawyer studied the room knowingly. "People here worship appearances. That's obvious." Olumide's eyes softened. "Do not let them intimidate you." Easy for him to say. He belonged here. Yande still felt like an intruder wearing borrowed confidence. A waiter passed offering champagne. Yande refused politely. Her throat already felt too tight to swallow anything. Then suddenly, the atmosphere near the entrance shifted. Whispers spread rapidly across the ballroom. Several cameras flashed. More guests turned toward the doors. Adewale Balogun had arrived. Yande froze instantly. Even after all these years, she recognized him immediately. Tall, sharp, confident, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo worth more than everything inside her shop combined. Beside him stood Zinhle in a glittering silver gown that drew attention from nearly every man in the room. Together, they looked powerful, untouchable, exactly the type of couple magazine covers loved. Yande's pulse quickened painfully. For one dangerous second, old memories returned too quickly. Adewale laughing with her in tiny apartments. Adewale kissing her forehead before business meetings. Adewale promising they would survive life together. Then came the darker memories, the insults, the coldness, the rain outside the mansion gates. Yande lowered her eyes immediately, hoping he would not notice her among the crowd. But destiny rarely shows mercy that way. Because at that exact moment, Adewale turned casually toward the ballroom and saw her. Everything inside him visibly stopped. The smile faded from his face instantly. Confusion crossed his eyes first, then disbelief, then something colder. Yande felt her stomach tighten violently. Zinhle noticed his reaction immediately. "What is it?" Adewale stared directly across the ballroom. At Yande. "No way," he muttered quietly. Several nearby guests followed his gaze curiously. Yande suddenly felt exposed beneath hundreds of invisible eyes. Olumide stepped slightly closer beside her. "Stay calm," he whispered. Too late. Because Adewale had already begun walking toward her. Slowly, deliberately. And with every step he took across that ballroom, whispers began spreading through the crowd. People sensed drama before understanding it. Yande's breathing became shallow. Part of her wanted to run, but another part remained frozen in place. Adewale finally stopped directly before her. For several seconds, he simply stared, taking in the simple cream dress, the worn handbag, the familiar softness still remaining in her eyes despite everything. Then, slowly, he laughed. Not loudly yet, just enough to cut deeply. "Yanda," he said in disbelief, "what are you doing here?" The ballroom around them seemed to quieten slightly. People nearby pretended not to listen while listening carefully anyway. Yande forced herself to remain calm. "I was invited." Adewale glanced briefly at her dress, then smirked. "Invited," he repeated softly. Zinhle approached beside him, now elegant and curious. "This is your ex-wife." The words alone felt humiliating. Not Yande, not a human being, just your ex-wife. A leftover piece from Adewale's poor past. Adewale continued, staring at the cream dress. And then, with the same cruel arrogance Yande remembered too well, he smiled coldly. "You still wear cheap clothes like this." The first wave of laughter nearby was quiet, but it had already begun. And before the night ended, everything would explode. For a moment, Yande could not breathe. The ballroom lights suddenly felt too bright. The orchestra music faded beneath the roaring sound of blood rushing through her ears, while dozens of curious eyes quietly gathered around them. Adewale's smirk widened slightly as he looked her up and down again. "You actually came here dressed like this?" he asked. The nearby laughter grew louder now. Not wild laughter, the controlled kind wealthy people used when pretending cruelty was entertainment. Yande tightened her grip on her handbag until her fingers hurt. Beside Adewale, Zinhle tilted her head slightly while examining the cream dress with open amusement. "I thought you said she disappeared," she said lightly. Adewale chuckled. "I assumed she had enough pride to avoid places like this." The words landed carefully, deliberately, like knives sharpened over years. Yande swallowed hard. Olumide stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Balogan," he said firmly, "this is neither the time nor the place." But Adewale barely looked at him. His attention remained fixed entirely on Yande. And somewhere beneath the arrogance in his eyes, something darker flickered too. Discomfort. Because despite her simple appearance, Yande did not look broken the way he expected. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "You should have at least called me," he continued coldly. "I could have sent money for a proper dress." Another wave of soft laughter moved through the surrounding guests. Yande felt humiliation burn beneath her skin. The same humiliation she once felt standing outside his mansion in the rain. The same humiliation she carried for years afterward whenever people whispered about her failed marriage. But tonight hurt differently, because now she knew the truth. She was no longer the helpless woman he abandoned. And yet she still stood there silently while people laughed at her clothes. Part of her hated herself for remaining quiet. Another part understood something important. Powerful people often revealed their ugliest selves when they believed someone beneath them could not fight back. Zinhul crossed her arms elegantly. "You know," she said softly, "I actually think the dress is brave." Several people nearby smiled immediately at the insult disguised as politeness. Yande finally looked directly at her. Brave Zinhle smiled sweetly. "Yes, most people wouldn't wear something so simple to an event like this." A few guests laughed openly now. A middle-aged businessman standing nearby whispered something to his wife while glancing at Yande's shoes. The wife shook her head with visible pity. Pity. Yande hated pity almost as much as cruelty. A waiter approached, nervously, with champagne, clearly sensing tension. Adewale grabbed a glass casually. Then, still staring at Yande, he said, "You always refuse to change." The statement hit deeper than the others, because it carried traces of old arguments, old wounds. Yande inhaled slowly. "I changed enough." Adewale laughed softly. "No, Yande. That was always the problem." His voice lowered slightly now, becoming more personal. "Even when I tried helping you improve yourself, you clung to poverty like it was some kind of identity." The cruelty of the statement stunned even some nearby listeners. Alumide's expression hardened immediately. "Mr. Balogan, I strongly advise you to stop speaking." But Adewale ignored him completely. Years of buried frustration were surfacing now. And somewhere deep inside himself, seeing Yande again triggered emotions he thought money had erased. Because despite her cheap dress, despite the worn shoes, despite the simplicity, she still carried a quiet dignity many wealthy women around him lacked. And that truth irritated him a great deal. "You should have stayed where you belonged," he said coldly. Silence spread wider across the ballroom now. More people had stopped pretending not to listen. Even the orchestra musicians seemed quieter somehow. Yande felt every eye watching her carefully, waiting. Would she cry? Beg to defend herself? But Yande simply stood there silently. And somehow her silence became more powerful than shouting ever could. Adewale mistook it for weakness, as he always had. "You know what's sad?" he continued. "I actually used to believe you'd become something one day." Olumide stepped forward sharply now. "That is enough." "No," Adewale snapped suddenly. "Let her answer." Yande slowly lifted her eyes toward him. For one brief moment, Adewale saw something unfamiliar inside them. Not fear, not love, distance. As if the woman standing before him had finally begun slipping beyond his control completely, and that frightened him more than he realized. Zinli noticed the strange tension too. She wrapped her arm around Adewale possessively. "Darling," she said lightly, "you're wasting your energy." Then she looked directly at Yande again. "You really should leave before security embarrasses you." Olumide's jaw tightened visibly. But before he could speak, Yande finally did, quietly, calmly. "I wasn't planning to stay long." Adewale smirked immediately. "Good decision." The cruelty in his tone caused another ripple of uncomfortable laughter nearby. But then something unexpected happened. Yande smiled. Not bitterly, not angrily, just softly. And somehow that small smile unsettled Adewale instantly, because it did not look like the smile of a defeated woman. It looked like someone carrying a secret. "What's funny?" he asked sharply. Yande shook her head gently. Nothing. Then she glanced briefly around the luxurious ballroom. The chandeliers, the diamonds, the wealthy guests pretending sophistication while enjoying another person's humiliation. And suddenly, she understood something clearly. These people were not gods, just human beings terrified of losing status, just people hiding insecurity beneath expensive clothing. For the first time all night, her fear weakened slightly. Adewale noticed the shift immediately. His expression darkened. "You still think pride can feed you?" he asked coldly. "Look at yourself, Yande." The words echoed painfully. Look at yourself. Years ago, those same words shattered her confidence completely. But tonight, something felt different. Yande looked directly into his eyes. And for one dangerous second, Adewale felt strangely exposed beneath her calm gaze, as if she could suddenly see every fear he hid behind wealth. The failing company, the investors losing trust, the desperation beneath the polished image. It made him angry instantly. "Tell me," he said mockingly, raising his champagne glass slightly, "what exactly do you do these days?" Still sewing clothes in that tiny little shop. Several nearby guests laughed again. Yande's throat tightened. Because, yes, that was exactly what she still did. And yet, for the first time in years, she no longer felt ashamed of it. "I work honestly," she answered softly. The simplicity of the response silenced a few people unexpectedly. Even Zinli blinked slightly. Adewale scoffed. "Honesty doesn't build empires." Yande almost responded. Almost. But then she remembered Olumide's warning. Not yet. The announcement tonight was still confidential. The board was not prepared. The empire remained unstable. So instead, Yande simply nodded once. "As I said," she whispered, "I won't stay long." Then slowly she turned and began walking away. The ballroom remained unusually quiet as she moved through the crowd. Some people watched with pity, others with curiosity, a few with guilt, because cruelty often becomes uncomfortable once the victim refuses to collapse publicly. Adewale stared after her irritation growing inside him unexpectedly. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt unsettled, because something about Yande's composure felt wrong. Too calm, too controlled, as if she knew something he didn't. Zinhal squeezed his arm gently. "Forget her," she murmured. But Adewale continued watching Yande disappear toward the far side of the ballroom. And deep inside himself, a strange unease quietly began growing. Meanwhile, near the private executive corridor behind the main ballroom, several senior board members of Mensa Global Holdings had already arrived, including men who knew exactly who Yande truly was. And before the night ended, the same woman mocked for her cheap dress would become the most powerful person in the room. The ballroom applause faded slowly as guests returned to their conversations, but the tension from Adewale's public humiliation still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Yande stood alone near the far balcony, overlooking the dark Atlantic waters beyond Echo Atlantic. Cool night wind brushed softly against her cream-colored dress, while distant Lagos lights flickered endlessly across the horizon. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to breathe properly. Her hands were still trembling, not because of fear anymore, because of restraint. Years ago, Adewale's words would have destroyed her completely. She would have cried herself to sleep afterward, replaying every insult until it became truth inside her own mind. But tonight, something had changed. The pain was still there, yet beneath it, another feeling had quietly begun growing. Clarity. Yande stared down at the ocean below. Money had not suddenly healed her wounds. It had only revealed how deeply those wounds still existed. You handled that better than most people would. Olumide's voice came gently from behind her. Yande turned slowly. The lawyer approached carrying 2 glasses of water. He handed one to her carefully. "Thank you," she whispered. Olumide studied her face. "You're angry." Yande gave a tired laugh. "I think I'm too exhausted to even be angry anymore. That man humiliated you publicly. He's done worse." The calmness in her voice unsettled even herself. Olumide leaned against the balcony railing beside her. "You should leave before the board meeting begins." Yande frowned slightly. "Board meeting?" The lawyer nodded. "Several senior executives are already gathered upstairs. They're discussing succession plans. Without me." A faint smile crossed his face. "Most of them still don't know you exist." The words sent another wave of anxiety through her chest. This empire still felt unreal, dangerous, like something too heavy for one human being to carry safely. Olumide continued quietly. Some members of the board expected control after Chief Mensah's death. Others want outside investors to take over leadership temporarily. "And what do you want?" The lawyer looked directly at her. "I want the rightful heir protected." Yande lowered her eyes. "You keep calling me heir as if I already belong in this world." "You do." "No," she whispered softly. "I inherited papers. That's not the same thing." Silence settled between them. Inside the ballroom, laughter and live music continued as if nothing important had happened tonight. But upstairs, powerful people were already fighting silently over billions. And now Yande stood at the center of it, whether she wanted to or not. Olumide finally spoke again. "You need to understand something clearly. Mensah Global is not simply a company." Yande listened carefully. "It controls thousands of jobs across multiple countries. Entire communities depend on it. Hospitals, schools, shipping ports, infrastructure projects." The weight of his words settled heavily inside her. "This is bigger than wealth," he continued. "Much bigger." Yande tightened her grip around the water glass. "I'm not prepared for this." "No one ever truly is." She looked at him honestly now. "What if I fail?" Olumide answered without hesitation. "Then dangerous people win." The simplicity of the response frightened her. Before Yande could reply, voices suddenly echoed from the hallway behind them. 2 men in expensive suits walked onto the balcony mid-conversation before abruptly stopping when they noticed her. One of them immediately recognized Olumide. "Ah, Mr. Afolayan," the older man said politely. Olumide nodded calmly. "Chairman Bello." The men approached slowly. Their eyes briefly moved toward Yande. Careful, assessing. The older executive smiled politely, but not warmly. "We were just discussing tomorrow's emergency board session." Olumide's expression remained unreadable. "I assumed you would be." Chairman Bello lowered his voice slightly. The company needs stability now more than sentiment. Yande immediately understood what he meant. They already feared her, not personally, strategically. To powerful executives, she was not a woman. She was uncertainty. The younger executive beside Bello glanced openly at Yande's dress before speaking quietly. With respect, we cannot place the empire into inexperienced hands. The insult arrived politely, dressed in corporate language. Still an insult. Olumide's eyes sharpened immediately. You speak as though the decision belongs to the board. Chairman Bello remained calm. The board protects shareholder confidence. No, Olumide replied firmly. The board protects itself. Silence. Dangerous silence. Yande suddenly realized something important. The real battle had not even begun yet. Adewale's humiliation downstairs was small compared to what waited ahead. These men were powerful, connected, experienced, and they clearly did not intend to surrender control easily to a former tailor from Surulere. Chairman Bello finally looked directly at Yande. Miss Akinola, he said smoothly, I'm sure this entire situation feels overwhelming. Yande nodded carefully. It does. Then perhaps the wisest path would be gradual involvement. Quiet involvement. Olumide's jaw tightened slightly. The younger executive continued. You could maintain your inheritance rights while allowing seasoned leadership to manage operations properly. Yande understood the hidden meaning immediately. Smile politely. Stay quiet. Let powerful men control everything, the same way powerful people had always controlled her life. For years she survived by remaining silent, by enduring humiliation quietly, by accepting less than she deserved, because fighting back seemed impossible. But tonight, something inside her resisted that instinct for the first time. What exactly are you afraid of? She asked softly. The men looked mildly surprised. Chairman Bello recovered first. Nobody is afraid. You're discussing me like I'm a problem before even meeting me. The younger executive forced a polite smile. This company cannot survive emotional decisions. Yande's eyes held his steadily now. And poverty taught me emotional decisions cost people everything. The statement caught them off guard, because her voice carried no bitterness, only truth. Chairman Bello studied her differently now, more carefully, as if realizing she might not be as fragile as expected. Before anyone could continue, another voice interrupted from the ballroom entrance. Adewale is asking about her again. The words came from Zinile. She stood near the doorway with crossed arms and obvious irritation. Her gaze moved coldly toward Yande. He thinks she left. Olumide's expression darkened slightly. Chairman Bello exchanged a quick glance with the younger executive. Interesting. Clearly none of them knew the connection between Adewale and the mysterious heir standing before them. Not yet. Zinli stepped closer. There you are, she said sharply toward Yande. Honestly, this obsession is becoming embarrassing. Yande frowned slightly. Excuse me, my fiancé feels guilty sometimes. Zinhol shrugged, carelessly. Men do that when they leave women behind. Olumide stepped forward immediately. That's enough. But Zinhol ignored him. She looked directly at Yande's simple cream dress again. You should stop making appearances in his life. It confuses people. The cruelty beneath her elegant tone reminded Yande painfully of the type of woman she herself once feared becoming. A woman who measured worth through status. Yande remained silent for several seconds. Then quietly, she asked, "Do you love him?" The question startled Zinli completely. "What do you love, Adewale?" Zinli laughed awkwardly. "What kind of question is that?" "The honest kind." Silence spread briefly across the balcony, and suddenly, Yande realized something surprising. Zinli did not know Adewale deeply at all. She loved the image, the influence, the success, but not the frightened man hidden beneath all that ambition. Yande once knew that frightened man intimately, perhaps better than anyone, and maybe that was why she no longer wanted him back, not even after everything changing around her. Because some heartbreaks eventually teach freedom instead of longing. Inside the ballroom, music suddenly stopped. A microphone crackled softly. Then a voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, members of Mensa Global Leadership will now gather privately upstairs." Chairman Bello straightened immediately. The executives exchanged serious looks. The real battle was beginning now. Olumide turned toward Yande carefully. "Are you ready?" Yande looked down briefly at her simple dress, then toward the ballroom full of people who mocked her only minutes earlier. Fear still existed. But beneath it, something stronger was finally awakening. Not revenge, not pride, authority. And slowly, quietly, Yande lifted her chin. "Yes," she said. For the first time in years, she was done shrinking herself for people who mistook kindness for weakness. The emergency board meeting began at exactly 10:15 p.m. Inside the private executive chamber above the ballroom, the atmosphere felt nothing like the glamorous gala downstairs. The room was colder, sharper. Every smile carried calculation behind it. A long black conference table stretched beneath crystal lighting while floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glowing Lagos coastline. Around the table sat some of the most powerful business figures in West Africa, and nearly all of them looked uncomfortable. Yande noticed it immediately as she entered beside Olumide, not because of her presence alone, because uncertainty frightened powerful people more than failure did. Chairman Bello stood near the head of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced carefully, "thank you for gathering on short notice." Several executives nodded politely. Others openly stared at Yande. Some tried hiding their surprise better than others. One woman near the far end of the table frowned openly at Yande's simple cream dress before whispering something to the executive beside her. Yande ignored it. She had spent too many years being judged by appearances to waste energy fearing it now. Still, her heartbeat remained painfully fast. Every instinct inside her screamed that she did not belong in this room. These people controlled governments, banks, international contracts, entire economies. And she still measured fabric for school uniforms inside a leaking shop in Surulere. Chairman Bello gestured toward an empty seat halfway down the table. "Please." Yande sat quietly. Olumide remained standing. Then the lawyer calmly placed a thick folder onto the table before everyone. The sound alone seemed to tighten the atmosphere. "I assume," Bello said carefully, that we are finally discussing the succession matter directly. Olamide nodded once. Yes. A heavy silence followed. Then another executive spoke first. We cannot continue delaying announcements, the man said sharply. Investors are already nervous. Markets are reacting. Another added, the company needs visible leadership immediately. Olumide listened quietly. Then finally he spoke. Chief Jabari Mensah anticipated this situation before his death. Every eye fixed on him immediately. He left behind legally binding instructions concerning succession. The older woman who previously mocked Yande's dress folded her arms. We've all seen the will. No, Olumide corrected calmly. You've seen portions of it. A subtle ripple of tension moved across the room. Chairman Bellow's expression hardened slightly. What exactly are you implying? Without answering immediately, Alamid slowly opened the folder. Then he removed several documents and placed them carefully on the table. Birth certificates, legal records, DNA confirmation reports, and finally, a photograph of Yande's mother beside Chief Jabari Mensah. Silence exploded across the room. Not loud silence, the dangerous kind. Several executives leaned forward immediately. Others exchanged shocked glances. Chairman Bellow stared at the documents for several long seconds before finally lifting his eyes toward Yande. You're serious, he murmured. Olumide's voice remained steady. Miss Yande Akinola is the biological daughter of Chief Jabari Mensah and sole legal heir to Mensah Global Holdings. The room erupted instantly. That's impossible. Why are we hearing this only now? This could destroy shareholder confidence. We need verification. Olumide's expression never changed. Everything has already been verified. The younger executive from the balcony meeting slammed his palm lightly against the table. A tailor from Lagos cannot suddenly control a multinational empire. The insult echoed sharply. Yande felt every eye shift toward her again, testing her, measuring weakness, waiting for her to collapse under pressure. For a brief second, fear tightened her throat. Then something unexpected happened. She remembered Mama Bisi's voice. You survived humiliation already. Why fear rich people now? The thought steadied her slightly. Chairman Bellow raised a hand for silence. Gradually the room quieted again. He turned toward Yande carefully. Miss Akinola, he said with respect, this situation is extremely sensitive. Yande nodded calmly. I understand. Do you... Another executive snapped. Do you understand what this company controls? The room became tense again immediately. The executive continued coldly. Tens of thousands of employees, Pomhan, deep on Mensah Global. Entire governments negotiate with us. International banks trust us. His eyes moved dismissively toward her dress. And now, suddenly, we're expected to hand leadership to someone with no corporate experience. The cruelty beneath the statement was obvious now, no longer hidden behind politeness. Yande inhaled slowly. Then, quietly, she asked, do you believe intelligence only exists in eyed, wealthy people? The question startled several executives. The man scoffed. This is not about intelligence. It's about competence. Yande nodded once. Then judge my competence fairly. The room fell silent again because nobody expected calmness from her. They expected insecurity, panic, gratitude, not composure. Alumid watched her carefully now, and for the first time since finding her, he began seeing traces of the leader Chief Mensah believed existed inside his daughter. Chairman Bello leaned back thoughtfully. You realize there are people who will fight this publicly. Yande met his gaze steadily. I've spent my whole life fighting quietly. The statement landed harder than she intended. Several faces around the table shifted slightly. Not sympathy, recognition, because pain carried a certain truth difficult to fake. Suddenly, the boardroom doors opened sharply. An assistant hurried inside, looking nervous. Sir, there's a problem downstairs. Chairman Bello frowned immediately. What now? The assistant hesitated awkwardly before answering. Mr. Adewale Balogun is asking questions about Miss Akinola. Yande felt tension move instantly through the room. Olumide's eyes narrowed. What kind of questions he overheard staff discussing the succession meeting? Chairman Bello cursed softly beneath his breath. Too late. The secrecy was already breaking apart. The younger executive looked immediately toward Yande. You brought unnecessary drama into this company before even taking control. Olumide stepped forward sharply. She didn't bring the drama. Your inability to manage information did, but the damage was already spreading. Outside the boardroom, whispers had begun moving through the gala like wildfire. The poor woman in the cheap dress. The ex-wife Adewale publicly humiliated. The mysterious heir connected to Mensah Global. Guests downstairs were already piecing the story together, and gossip among Africa's elite traveled faster than truth. Chairman Bello stood slowly. We need containment immediately. Alamid shook his head. No. We need transparency. The executives immediately began arguing again. Public announcement tonight. Delay until morning. Protect stock prices. Protect investor confidence. Protect the company image. Yande listened quietly while powerful people debated her existence like a corporate crisis. And suddenly, something became painfully clear. None of them were asking what she wanted. Not truly. Because to most people in this room, she was still not fully human yet. Just a variable. A risk. A headline. The realization hurt more than she expected. Then, unexpectedly, Yande spoke loudly enough to silence the room herself. Stop! The executives froze. Even Chairman Bello looked surprised. Yande slowly stood from her chair. Her hands still trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. I did not ask for this empire. Complete silence. I didn't know Chief Mensah. I didn't grow up with privilege. And I certainly didn't walk into this room believing I'm better than anyone here. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Yande continued, but don't mistake humility for weakness. The words settled heavily across the table. For the first time all night, nobody interrupted her. Nobody mocked her dress. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Because suddenly the room felt different. The balance had shifted slightly. Not fully, but enough. Yande looked around slowly at every powerful face surrounding her. I know what it means to lose everything, she said quietly. And maybe that's exactly why I understand responsibility better than people who inherited comfort. The room remained completely silent now, and somewhere downstairs, beyond the glittering ballroom and gossiping elites at Adewale Balogun, was already forcing his way toward the executive floor. Completely unaware that the woman he once discarded had just begun stepping into her true power. By midnight, Lagos had begun raining again. Water slid down the enormous glass windows of the executive floor, while thunder rolled faintly above the Atlantic coast. Inside the boardroom, tension still hung heavily in the air after Yande's speech. Nobody underestimated her anymore. That frightened them even more. Chairman Bello remained seated quietly near the head of the table, fingers folded carefully together, while executives whispered among themselves in low voices. Olumide stood beside the windows, watching the storm outside. And Yande simply sat silently. Exhaustion had begun settling deep into her body now. Everything had changed too quickly. Only 1 week earlier, her biggest concern involved overdue rent and broken sewing needles. Now she sat inside one of Africa's most powerful corporate meetings while billionaires argued about her future. It felt unreal, dangerously unreal. Suddenly, the boardroom doors burst open. Several executives looked up sharply in irritation. Then Adewale entered. His expression was tense, controlled, but his eyes immediately searched the room until they landed on Yande and froze. Because now there was no misunderstanding left, no rumors, no confusion. The truth sat directly before him. Yande slowly rose from her chair. The room became completely silent. Adewale looked around slowly at the executives, the legal documents spread across the table, then finally toward Olumide. "You're serious," he said quietly. Nobody answered immediately. They didn't need to. Adewale's breathing slowed. His eyes moved back toward Yande again, this time differently. Not dismissive, not mocking, trying to understand. "You," he whispered faintly. Yande held his gaze calmly. For years she imagined moments like this. Moments where the people who humiliated her would finally realize her worth too late. She thought victory would feel satisfying. Instead, it felt strangely sad. Because Adewale still looked like the same man she once loved, beneath all the pride and expensive clothing. Just more lost now. Chairman Bello stood carefully. "Mr. Balogun, this meeting is private." Adewale ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed entirely on Yande. "You inherited Mensa Global." Yande nodded once. Silence. Adewale laughed suddenly, not with humor. Disbelief. "This is insane," one executive muttered impatiently. "We don't have time for personal drama." But Adewale barely heard him. His mind was racing violently now. Every memory from earlier tonight returned at once. The cheap dress, the public humiliation, the laughter. Dear God. He had mocked the future owner of Mensa Global in front of half the African business world. A cold sensation crawled slowly through his chest. Not guilt first, fear, because Adewale immediately understood the danger. His company desperately needed the Mensa Global contract. Without it, investors would flee. Banks would panic. Projects would collapse. And now the woman controlling his future was the same woman he publicly humiliated only hours ago. Zinhli suddenly appeared behind him, breathless from rushing upstairs. "What's going on?" she demanded. Then she saw the room. The documents, the executives. Yande standing near the center of it all. Confusion crossed her face instantly. Chairman Bello looked exhausted already. "Mr. Balogun," he said sharply, This situation is already unstable enough. But Adewale stepped forward slowly toward Yande. For the first time in years, uncertainty visibly cracked his confidence. You knew, he asked quietly. Yande answered honestly. Not when I arrived tonight. The response somehow made him feel worse, because it meant she endured the humiliation while already carrying overwhelming news alone. Zinhli frowned deeply. Adewale, somebody explain what's happening. Nobody answered her immediately. Then Olumide spoke calmly. Miss Yande Akinola is the legal heir to Chief Jabari Mensah's estate. The words hit Zinli like physical force. What? Her eyes snapped toward Yande again, toward the cream dress she mocked earlier, the worn handbag, the woman she dismissed completely. Impossible! You're joking, Zinli whispered. Olumide did not reply, because truth no longer required defending. A heavy silence spread through the room again. Then unexpectedly, Adewale spoke softly. Yande, I didn't know. The sentence almost sounded painful. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Yande looked at him carefully. Years ago, hearing weakness in his voice would have shattered her completely. Tonight, it only made her tired. You knew enough, she answered quietly. The words cut deeper than shouting ever could. Adewale lowered his eyes briefly. Because she was right. Even without knowing about the inheritance, he still chose cruelty, still chose humiliation, still laughed while others mocked her. Money had not created that ugliness tonight. It merely exposed it publicly. Zinhle crossed her arms tightly. So what now? She asked sharply. Everyone suddenly bows because she inherited money. Yande turned toward her calmly. No. The simplicity of the answer surprised everyone. I don't want anyone bowing. Chairman Bello watched her carefully now, always studying, always calculating, and perhaps for the first time, he began understanding why Chief Mensah chose this woman. Not because she was polished, because she understood dignity without needing wealth to validate it. Adewale finally stepped closer. I need to speak with you privately. Olumide immediately intervened. That would be inappropriate right now. But Yande raised her hand gently. It's all right. The lawyer hesitated, then slowly nodded. The room remained tense as Yande and Adewale walked toward the quieter balcony outside the boardroom. Rainfall surrounded the city beyond them. For several seconds, neither spoke. Adewale looked different now beneath the stormlight. Older somehow. Less untouchable. Finally, he exhaled slowly. I embarrassed you. Yande almost smiled sadly. That isn't new. Pain flickered briefly across his face. Aren't you angry? She thought carefully before answering. I was angry for years. And now Yande looked out toward Lagos. Now I think I'm just free. The statement unsettled him deeply, because Adewale suddenly realized something terrifying. He no longer held emotional power over her. For years, even after the divorce, some hidden part of him believed Yande still carried love for him somewhere beneath the pain. But standing beside her now, he felt distance, permanent distance. You hate me, he said quietly. Yande shook her head slowly. No. The answer surprised both of them. I survived you, she continued softly. That's different. Thunder rolled faintly across the ocean. Adewale rubbed his forehead tiredly. You don't understand what this means for my company. Yande looked at him carefully, and there it was, the real fear. Not losing her, losing power. She suddenly understood him more clearly than ever before. Even now, his first instinct was survival, business, reputation, control, not remorse, not truly. Adewale, she asked quietly, if I were still poor tonight, would you regret humiliating me? He froze completely, because he could not answer honestly without exposing himself. Yande nodded faintly. That's what I thought. She turned to leave, but Adewale grabbed her wrist gently. Not violently, desperately. Please, he whispered, don't destroy me. The sentence broke something quietly inside her. Not because she wanted revenge, because she finally saw how terrified he truly was beneath all his arrogance. Yande slowly pulled her hand free. Then, softly, she said, I never had the power to destroy you, Adewale. She looked directly into his eyes one final time. You've been destroying yourself for years. And with that, Yande walked back into the boardroom, while rain continued pouring across Lagos outside. Behind her, Adewale remained frozen alone on the balcony, watching the woman he once discarded walk steadily toward a future he could no longer control. By sunrise, the story had already spread across Lagos, not through newspapers first, through whispers, inside luxury salons in Lekki, inside executive offices in Victoria Island, inside private WhatsApp groups where wealthy people exchange gossip disguised as concern. Adewale Balogun publicly mocked his ex-wife at the Mensa Global Gala, only to discover she was the billionaire heir to the entire empire. The story moved through the city like wildfire, and by morning, everyone wanted details. Yande woke after barely 2 hours of sleep. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the streets outside wet and glistening beneath pale morning sunlight. For several quiet moments, she remained lying on the small bed inside her tiny apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling above her. Everything felt strangely still. Then her phone began ringing, again and again and again. Unknown numbers, messages, missed calls. People who had ignored her for years suddenly remembered her existence overnight. Yande slowly sat up. Her chest tightened as she scrolled through the messages. Former acquaintances, distant relatives, old customers, even women who once mocked her during the divorce, were suddenly sending cheerful congratulations filled with fake affection. She switched the phone off immediately. Silence felt safer. A soft knock came at the door moments later. Mama Bisi entered carefully carrying tea. The elderly woman studied Yende's face with concern. You didn't sleep? Yande gave a tired smile. I think my life forgot how to be normal. Mama Bisi placed the tea beside her gently. Outside voices echoed faintly from the street below. People were already talking. Curious neighbors pretended to pass by the shop while secretly trying to confirm rumors. One woman even paused dramatically outside the window before whispering loudly, "That's her." Yande closed her eyes briefly. This was exactly what she feared. Money did not simply change circumstances. It changed how people looked at you. And somehow, that transformation felt lonely already. Meanwhile, across Lagos, Adewale sat inside his office, staring silently at his phone, while panic slowly consumed the room around him. News articles had begun appearing online. Business blogs, celebrity gossip pages, even major financial media outlets were now reporting on the mystery heir connected to Mensa Global Holdings. And every version of the story included one humiliating detail. Adewale publicly insulted her before learning the truth. His assistant stood nervously near the office doorway. "Sir, investors are asking questions." Adewale rubbed both hands across his face slowly. "About what? The gala incident?" "Of course. Because weakness spread quickly in elite circles, and public humiliation attached itself to reputations like blood in water." His phone buzzed again. "Richard Delemini." Adewale answered immediately. "Richard, what exactly happened last night?" The investor interrupted sharply. Adewale exhaled slowly. "It's being exaggerated. Did you insult the future owner of Mensa Global Silence?" Richard cursed quietly. "You've put us in an impossible position." Adewale stood abruptly from his chair. "I can fix this." "How?" Adewale had no answer ready, because deep down, even he understood the damage was larger than embarrassment. He had revealed something ugly publicly. Cruelty, arrogance, desperation. And wealthy investors hated emotional instability almost as much as financial risk. After the call ended, Adewale walked toward the giant office windows overlooking Lagos. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely afraid. Not because Yande inherited money, because she no longer needed his approval. That truth unsettled him more than losing business ever could. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Zinli entered sharply. Unlike usual, she did not kiss him, did not smile. Her expression was cold. "My father saw the articles." Adewale turned slowly. "And he's furious." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Join the line." Zinli crossed her arms tightly. "You embarrassed both of us." Adewale stared at her carefully. Interesting. Even now she focused on image first, not feelings, not betrayal. Image. Perhaps that was why their relationship suddenly looked emptier than ever before. "She's still the same woman," he muttered quietly. Zinli frowned. "What? Yande?" The room became still. "She inherited billions overnight." Zinli snapped. "Of course she's different now." But Adewale shook his head slowly. "No, because that was the terrifying part. Yande had remained calm even after gaining unimaginable power. And suddenly, Adewale understood something deeply uncomfortable. She had always been stronger than him. She simply lacked money before. Back in Surulere, Yande stood outside her tailoring shop later that afternoon, watching children chase each other through puddles left behind by the storm. Life around her neighborhood continued normally. Street vendors argued over prices. Generators rattled loudly. Women carried baskets across crowded roads. And somehow that ordinary chaos comforted her. Olumide's black car arrived quietly beside the shop. The lawyer stepped out immediately. "You're avoiding your phone." Yande smiled faintly. "Is it obvious?" "Very." He glanced toward the growing crowd, pretending not to stare nearby. "The media will become worse." Yande sighed softly. "I know." Olumide lowered his voice. "The board has scheduled tonight's formal succession announcement." Her stomach tightened instantly. Tonight. Real. permanent. She looked down at her simple sandals. I'm not ready. You may never feel ready. The same answer again. Yande leaned against the shop doorway quietly. What if they hate me? Olumide studied her carefully. Some already do. The honesty startled her, but strangely, she appreciated it more than comfort. Power attracts resentment, he continued calmly, especially when it arrives unexpectedly. Yande looked away toward the noisy street. Children laughing, women bargaining. Real people, not boardrooms and billionaires. This place feels more honest, she whispered. Olumide followed her gaze. Because these people know suffering. Yande nodded slowly. Then something suddenly became clear inside her. All those executives upstairs feared losing power. But the people here feared survival itself. Rent, food, hospital bills, school fees, real problems. And maybe that was exactly why Chief Mensah chose her. Not because she understood wealth, because she understood hardship. That realization steadied her slightly. Olumide handed her another envelope. Inside rested a new invitation, formal succession ceremony. Mensa Global Headquarters, 7 p.m. Yande stared at it quietly. Then she looked toward her sewing machine inside the shop, the old machine that carried her through loneliness, heartbreak, and hunger. For years, it was the only thing fully under her control. And tonight, she would step into a world where almost nothing would feel simple anymore. Miss Yande, a voice suddenly shouted from across the street. A young mother hurried toward her, nervously holding a little girl's hand. Yande recognized her immediately. A former customer. The woman stopped awkwardly. I just wanted to say. Her eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. Seeing what happened to you gives women like us hope. Yande blinked softly. The woman continued. They treated you badly because you were poor. But you survived anyway. The little girl smiled shyly beside her mother, and suddenly, Yande understood something important. This story no longer belonged only to her. People were watching. Women abandoned like she was. People humiliated for being poor. People taught their value depended on wealth. Maybe her survival meant something bigger now. Yande slowly looked back toward Olumide. Then quietly she said, Tonight, I won't hide anymore. And somewhere far across Lagos, Adewale, Balogun stared at headlines spreading across every major business platform in Africa, realizing the woman he once threw away was about to become one of the most powerful figures on the continent. By 7 p.m., the headquarters of Mensah Global Holdings looked less like a corporate building and more like the center of a political revolution. Luxury vehicles lined the enormous entrance, while camera flashes exploded endlessly beneath the evening sky. Journalists crowded behind security barriers, shouting questions at every arriving executive. Is the mystery heir attending tonight? Will the board confirm leadership changes? What does this mean for African markets? Inside the towering glass building, tension moved through every hallway like electricity. Employees whispered nervously near elevators. Executives spoke in low, urgent voices. Even security guards seemed unusually alert, because tonight was no longer simply a corporate announcement. It was history. And at the center of it all stood Yande. She waited quietly inside a private preparation room overlooking Lagos Island. The cream-colored dress still rested gently against her skin, untouched by diamonds or designer labels. Alamid had offered stylists, jewelry, luxury gowns flown in from Johannesburg. Yande refused all of it. "I want to look like myself," she told him earlier. And somehow that decision terrified the board more than any expensive appearance could have. Because authenticity carried a strange kind of power wealthy people often forgot how to recognize. A soft knock came at the door. Olumide entered carefully. "They're ready." Yande looked toward the mirror one final time. For a brief second, she still saw the same woman who once cried herself to sleep after being thrown out into the rain. The same tailor from Sur Ulere. The same woman mocked for her cheap clothes. But now something else existed inside her too. Not arrogance. Strength. Quiet tested strength. "Are you afraid?" Olumide asked softly. Yande smiled faintly. "Yes." The lawyer nodded approvingly. "Good. Fear keeps powerful people human." Outside the massive auditorium, hundreds of guests filled the hall. Investors, politicians, diplomats, journalists, and some of the wealthiest business leaders on the continent. At the center of the front row sat Adewale, alone. Zingli had refused to attend beside him after the scandal exploded publicly across social media. Several investors now kept visible distance from him too. For the first time in years, Adewale felt isolated inside a room full of powerful people. And somehow that loneliness forced him to confront himself more honestly than success ever had. He stared toward the stage silently while regret slowly poisoned his chest. Not only because he mocked Yande, because he finally realized what he truly lost years ago. A woman who loved him before money. A woman who remained kind even after suffering humiliation. A woman stronger than every wealthy person currently sitting in that room. The auditorium lights dimmed suddenly. Silence spread immediately. Then Chairman Bello stepped onto the stage beneath the enormous Mensa Global logo glowing behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began formally, "thank you for gathering during this important transition in our company's history." Cameras flashed rapidly. Bello continued speaking about Chief Jabari Mensa's legacy, the company's future, and economic stability. But the audience's attention remained restless, waiting. Everyone wanted to see her. Finally, Bello paused. Then slowly he said, "Tonight we formally introduce the legal successor chosen personally by Chief Jabari Mensa before his passing." Complete silence filled the auditorium. Adewale's pulse quickened painfully. He already knew what was coming. Still, part of him remained unable to fully believe it. Bello looked toward the side entrance, then announced clearly, "Miss Yande Akinola." The doors opened, and Yande walked in. No diamonds, no dramatic music, no glittering gown. Only the same cream-colored dress people mocked the night before. But now as she crossed the stage calmly beneath hundreds of staring eyes, something extraordinary happened. Nobody laughed, because power had changed the room completely. The same dress once called cheap suddenly looked elegant, dignified, timeless. Not because the fabric changed, because people's perception changed the moment wealth became attached to it. And Yande noticed every hypocritical second of it. She stepped onto the stage slowly while cameras flashed endlessly. Adewale stared at her without blinking. His chest tightened painfully. because for the first time, he truly saw her, not as his ex-wife, not as poverty, not as weakness, as a woman who survived him. Chairman Bello handed her the microphone carefully. The auditorium remained silent, waiting. Yande looked out across the crowd. Executives, investors, politicians, journalists, people who once would never even notice someone like her existed. And suddenly, she remembered the women from her neighborhood. Mama Bisi, the little girl holding her mother's hand outside the shop. All the people society treated as invisible simply because they lacked money. Yande inhaled slowly. Then she spoke. My entire life, she began softly, people taught me that poverty makes you small. The room became completely still. They taught me poor people should remain grateful for crumbs, silent during humiliation, invisible inside rooms like this. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Yande's eyes moved calmly through the audience. Last night, many people laughed at this dress. A ripple of tension spread immediately. Adewale lowered his eyes. But tonight, Yande continued. The same dress suddenly deserves respect. Silence. Painful silence. Because everyone understood exactly what she meant. Nothing about me changed overnight, she said quietly. Only your knowledge of my bank account. The words struck the room like thunder. Several journalists typed furiously. Cameras flashed non-stop now. Yande continued calmly. I stand here today not because I'm better than anyone else, but because I understand something wealth alone cannot teach. Her voice softened slightly. I know what it feels like to be dismissed. Adewale closed his eyes briefly. Every word felt personal now. I know what it feels like to be judged before speaking, to be treated as less human because life became difficult. Yande looked directly toward the front rows. And I refuse to build the future of this company on arrogance. The room remained frozen beneath her voice. Then slowly, she opened another folder resting beside the podium. Olumide watched carefully. The board members stiffened immediately. Because now came the second shock. Yande lifted several financial documents into view. Before accepting leadership, she said calmly, I ordered a quiet review of recent internal contracts. Chairman Bello's expression changed instantly. So did several executives. There are individuals within this company, Yande continued, who abused Chief Mensah's death to manipulate investments and secretly divert funds through shell partnerships. The auditorium erupted in shocked whispers. Several journalists stood immediately. Adewale frowned deeply. What? Yande's voice remained steady. These investigations are already being transferred to federal authorities tonight. Panic visibly spread across the faces of certain executives. One board member stood abruptly. This is outrageous, Yande answered calmly. Stealing from workers and shareholders is outrageous. Security officers suddenly entered from the rear of the auditorium. The atmosphere exploded into chaos. Executives shouting, journalists rushing forward, cameras flashing wildly, and in the center of it all stood Yande, still calm despite the storm surrounding her. Adewale watched silently, stunned beyond words. Because the woman he once mocked for weakness had just done something few powerful people ever dared. She chose justice publicly. Not revenge, justice. And in that moment, Adewale finally understood the truth completely. Yande had become everything he once pretended to be: strong, honorable, respected, while he, despite all his wealth, stood there feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. 3 months later, Lagos looked different to Yande, not because the city itself had changed, but because she no longer walked through it invisible. Everywhere she went, now people recognized her face. Newspapers called her the tailor who inherited an empire. Business magazines praised her leadership after the corruption scandal inside Mensa Global led to multiple arrests and major reforms across the company. Television hosts invited her to interviews. Politicians requested meetings. Investors who once doubted her now praised her vision. Yande learned quickly that success often rewrote people's memories. The same executives who questioned her intelligence now spoke about her with admiration. The same social elites who laughed at her dress suddenly called her elegant. And somehow, that hypocrisy saddened her more than it angered her, because it proved what she said that night was true. Nothing about her humanity had changed, only her status. One bright Saturday morning, Yande stood quietly outside a newly renovated community center in Surulere, while children ran laughing across the courtyard behind her. The sign above the building read, "The Adesua Foundation for Women and Children, Rebuilding Their Lives," named after her mother. Not Chief Mensa, not herself, her mother. The woman who suffered silently while carrying secrets, heartbreak, and survival alone. Yande smiled softly as dozens of women entered the center carrying sewing materials, notebooks, and small children. Some were widows. Some escaped abusive marriages. Some simply needed another chance after life became cruel. Yande understood all of them, because pain recognized pain. Mama Bisi approached proudly, wearing a bright blue head wrap and expensive glasses she still wasn't fully used to. "You're thinking too much again," the old woman teased. Yande laughed quietly. "You always know." Mama Bisi looked around the bustling center emotionally. "You built all this in 3 months. We built it." The older woman squeezed her hand gently. "No, you chose not to become bitter. And perhaps that was Yande's greatest victory of all. Not the billions, not the power, not the headlines. The fact that suffering did not harden her heart completely." A black SUV slowly pulled into the parking area nearby. Yande recognized the vehicle immediately. Adewale stepped out quietly. Gone were the confident smiles and polished arrogance that once followed him everywhere. His company had collapsed publicly after investors withdrew support during the scandal fallout. Several luxury projects remained unfinished across Lagos, and business magazines that once celebrated him now described him as a cautionary tale of executive pride. He looked thinner now, older, more honest somehow. Mama Bisi frowned immediately. What is he doing here? Yande remained calm. It's all right. Adewale approached slowly until he stopped a respectful distance away. For several moments, neither spoke. Children laughed in the background. Women carried fabrics into the center. Life moved peacefully around them, completely different from the glamorous ballrooms where their story exploded months earlier. Finally, Adewale spoke softly. You look happy. Yande glanced around the center. I think I'm learning how to be. A faint, sad smile crossed his face. You deserve it. The words sounded sincere, and that alone revealed how much life had humbled him already. Adewale lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. I wanted to apologize again. Yande studied him carefully. You already apologized. Not properly. Silence settled between them. Then quietly he admitted, I hated poverty so much that I became cruel to anyone who reminded me of it. Yandi felt sadness move softly through her chest because she remembered the young man from Yaba Market, the poor dreamer who once promised to protect her forever. Somewhere along the way, fear transformed him into someone neither of them recognized anymore. I loved you once, Adewale whispered. Yande nodded slowly. I know, and I destroyed it. This time she did not deny it, because healing required honesty too. Adewale glanced toward the women entering the foundation building. You built something meaningful. I'm trying. He hesitated carefully before speaking again. I heard you refuse to buy another mansion. Yande smiled faintly. The old apartment still feels more real. Adewale laughed softly under his breath. That sounds exactly like you. For the first time in years, the tension between them felt strangely peaceful. Not romantic, not bitter. Finished. Finally, finished. Adewale reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small envelope. I wanted to return this. Yande frowned slightly before opening it. Inside rested the old wedding photograph she thought she lost years ago. The younger versions of themselves smiled brightly in the picture. Poor, hopeful, in love. Yande stared at it quietly. I kept it all this time, Adewale admitted softly. I don't know why. Because some parts of love survive even after people destroy each other. Yande carefully slid the photograph back into the envelope, then gently handed it back to him. You keep it. Adewale looked surprised. You don't want it? Yande smiled sadly. No, not because she hated the memory, because she no longer needed it. The past no longer owned her. A long silence passed. Then Adewale finally nodded slowly. I understand. He stepped backward toward the waiting SUV. Before entering, he looked at her one final time. You became stronger than all of us. Yande shook her head gently. No. Her eyes moved toward the women inside the foundation. I just survived. And sometimes survival itself became a kind of greatness. Adewale left quietly after that. No dramatic ending, no reconciliation, just two people finally accepting the truth about what they became. As the SUV disappeared into Lagos, traffic, Mama Bisi walked back toward Yande carrying 2 cups of tea. He still loves you, the old woman muttered. Yande smiled softly while watching children play across the courtyard. Maybe she answered calmly. Then after a moment she added, but I finally love myself too. And for the first time in many years, those words felt completely true. After years of heartbreak, humiliation, and rejection, Yande discovered something powerful. Your value does not decrease because others fail to recognize it. Too many people in this world judge human beings by clothing, money status, or connections. But true character is revealed during moments of pain, loss, and survival. Yande was mocked when she looked poor, then respected when she became wealthy. Yet she remained the same woman the entire time. That is the tragedy of society, but also the lesson. Never allow people's opinions to define your worth. Sometimes the greatest victory is not revenge, it is healing. It is refusing to let suffering turn you cruel. It is choosing dignity even after life breaks your heart. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of your situation? And if you believe kindness, justice, and hope still matter in this world, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Your story is not over yet.